The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and Elena Marsh had exactly 2 coins left in her pocket when she saw the watch lying on the wet bench. Her hands were shaking from cold, not fear, but the moment her fingers closed around the metal case, her heart began to pound as if she had done something wrong. She looked around the empty park, half expecting someone to shout at her, to accuse her of taking what was not hers. No one came. The chain was broken, the glass face was speckled with rain, and the weight of it in her palm felt heavier than any coin she had ever held. She almost put it in her bag and walked away. She had every reason to. Her mother, Nora, had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and the landlord, a stern man named Mr. Grady, had already knocked twice that week, asking for rent she did not have. A watch like this, gold-cased and old, could feed them for a month if sold to the right buyer. She knew a man near the market who asked no questions about where things came from. She had walked past his shop a dozen times in the last year, always telling herself she would never need to. But when she turned the watch over in her hand, she saw initials engraved on the back, a small letter A curled inside a letter R, and something in her chest refused to let her keep walking. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself hunger did not care about initials. And yet her feet carried her not toward the market, but toward the tall iron gates at the edge of town, the ones that led to Ashworth Manor, because everyone in the village knew that only one family wore initials like that, and only one man in the county was known simply as the Lord. The walk took nearly an hour, and by the time she reached the gates, her shoes were soaked through, and her fingers had gone numb around the watch, which she had wrapped carefully in a handkerchief so the rain would not damage it further. A man stood at the gatehouse, tall and unfriendly, his coat buttoned to the collar despite the mild chill. He looked at her, the way people often looked at her lately, as if her worn dress and thin frame told him everything he needed to know about her character. "State your business," he said, before she had even opened her mouth. "I found something," Elena said. "It belongs to your master. I want to return it to him directly." The man's eyebrows lifted, and something like a smile crossed his face, though it held no warmth. "You want to see the Lord himself, over a trinket you claim to have found." "I do not claim anything," Elena said, and her voice steadied, even as her hands trembled. "I found it. I want to give it back." "People come here every week with stories like yours," he said. "Lost rings, lost brooches, lost coins. They all want a reward for their honesty. Leave it with me, girl, and go home." Something in his tone made her chest tighten, not with anger exactly, but with a stubborn kind of pride. She had walked an hour in the rain, had turned away from a solution to all her troubles, and she was not about to hand the watch to a stranger who assumed the worst of her before she had said 10 words. "I will not leave it with anyone but him," she said. "If he refuses to see me, then I will take it back the way I brought it, and that will be the end of the matter." The gatekeeper studied her for a long moment, perhaps surprised that she did not flinch, perhaps annoyed that she had not simply obeyed him. Finally he sighed and told her to wait. He disappeared through a side door, and Elena stood in the rain, the watch pressed against her chest beneath her shawl, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake by refusing 30 pieces of silver, for a matter of principle, that no one else would ever know about. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing there soaked and shivering at the gates of a house she had never entered, was that the watch had not been lost at all. It had been placed on that bench 3 hours earlier, by a servant, under strict instruction, left exactly where someone desperate and unlucky might find it, exactly where a person with nothing to lose might decide there was no harm in keeping it. It was the 4th such object left in the village that season, following a ring left at the bakery counter and a small pouch of coins left near the well, and like the 2 objects before it, it had been placed there by a man who no longer believed most people were honest, and who had built a quiet, careful test to prove himself right. Lord Reginald Ashworth had once believed the best in everyone. He had grown up in a house full of servants who adored him, tenants who thanked him, and neighbors who praised his generosity to his face. It had taken him nearly 40 years and several bitter disappointments to understand that praise and honesty were not the same thing, that people who smiled at him often lied to him just as easily, and that the only way to know a person's true character was to test them when they believed no one important was watching. So he had begun leaving valuables in places where ordinary people, tired people, hungry people, might find them. Most were never returned. A few were returned to servants with clear expectation of reward. None, until now, had been carried an hour on foot in the rain by someone insisting on delivering it to him personally, expecting nothing in return. Inside the gatehouse, the gatekeeper, a man named Colby who had served the family for 11 years, made his way through the side corridor, toward the study, where he knew the Lord often sat with his ledgers in the late afternoon. He found him instead in the small sitting room near the kitchen, dressed plainly, sleeves rolled, a look of quiet boredom on his face, that vanished the moment Colby explained what waited at the gate. "A young woman, my lord. Says she found something of yours. Refuses to leave it with anyone but you." Reginald set down his cup slowly. This was different from the others. The baker's boy had handed the ring to a maid without a word of protest. The old fisherman near the well had pocketed the coins and never come near the house at all, which Reginald had noted with quiet disappointment, but no real surprise. This woman, whoever she was, had walked to his gate and refused to be turned away. "Bring her in," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "But do not tell her who I am. Say I am the groundskeeper. Let us see what she does when she believes she is speaking to no one of importance." Colby hesitated only a moment before nodding and returning to the gate. Elena was led through a side path she had never seen, past hedges trimmed into perfect shapes and a garden that seemed to belong to a painting rather than a real place. She felt entirely out of place in her wet patched dress, and she kept her eyes down as Colby led her toward a man standing near a low stone wall, dressed in a simple brown coat, his sleeves pushed up as if he had been working with his hands. He did not look like a lord. He looked like any man who tended gardens for a living, and something in Elena relaxed slightly at the sight of him, though she could not have said why.
"You found something," the man said, his voice calm, almost curious, as Colby stepped back a respectful distance.
"Yes, sir," Elena said, and she held out the handkerchief-wrapped bundle without hesitation. "A watch. I found it on a bench near the old chapel this morning. I believe it belongs to the lord of this house, based on the initials." The man took it carefully, unwrapping the handkerchief with unhurried fingers, studying the watch, as though he had never seen it before in his life, though of course he had chosen it himself from his late father's collection that very morning. "And you brought it all this way," he said, "rather than sell it or keep it for yourself." Elena felt her cheeks warm, not from shame, but from the bluntness of the question. "I thought about it," she admitted, because something about his steady gaze made lying feel impossible. "I will not pretend I did not think about it, but it was not mine to keep, whatever my situation." "And what is your situation?" the man asked, tilting his head slightly. "That is not why I came," Elena said quickly. "I did not come here to speak of my troubles. I came to return what was lost." The man said nothing for a long moment, simply looking at her the way one might study a puzzle that refused to behave the way expected. Then he nodded slowly, as if some private question had been answered, though Elena could not have guessed what that question was. "Thank you," he said finally. "I will see that it reaches the master of the house." "Then he is not here," Elena said, glancing toward the great stone building behind them. "He is somewhere close," the man said, with the faintest trace of something that might have been amusement, though Elena was too tired and too cold to notice it clearly. "You have done a kind thing today. Whatever brought you to that bench this morning, whatever trouble follows you home, know that honesty like yours is rare, and it does not go unnoticed." Elena did not know what to make of such words from a groundskeeper, but she was too exhausted to question them. She thanked him, turned, and began the long walk back through the rain, her stomach empty, her shoes ruined, her mother waiting at home, with nothing but hope, and a story about a watch that would soon feed no one, because Elena had chosen, against every hard fact of her life, to walk away with nothing but her own conscience intact. Behind her, Reginald Ashworth stood by the stone wall for a long time after she disappeared through the gate, turning the old watch over in his hands, thinking not of the timepiece at all, but of the woman who had refused to keep it, and of Colby's earlier report that she had walked an hour to reach the gate, and would walk an hour more to reach whatever home was waiting for her, empty-handed and unrewarded, because she believed it was the only right thing to do. That night, as Elena climbed the narrow stairs to the small room she shared with her mother, she said nothing of the watch, nothing of the strange groundskeeper with his careful questions, nothing of the ache in her stomach that no amount of pride could fill. Nora looked up from her chair by the window, her face thin and pale in the candlelight, and asked only if Elena had found work that day. Elena told her not yet, and helped her mother into bed, and lay awake long after the candle had burned down, wondering if she had been foolish, wondering if honesty was a virtue that only wealthy people could afford, and wondering, though she pushed the thought away as quickly as it came, why the groundskeeper's eyes had followed her so carefully as she left, as though he were memorizing something about her that even she did not yet understand. She could not have known that behind those garden walls, a man who owned more land than she could imagine, sat awake far past midnight, staring at a watch he had deliberately lost, thinking of a woman he had deliberately tested, already deciding that whatever happened next, he would not let her walk away so easily a second time. The knock on the door came at dawn, sharp and impatient, 3 times in quick succession, and Elena's stomach dropped before she had even risen from her chair. She knew that knock. She had heard it before, always at the worst possible hour, always followed by the same demand. Mr. Grady stood on the other side when she opened the door, his coat buttoned tight, his expression already set into the shape of a man who expected disappointment and would not be surprised by it. "The rent was due yesterday," he said without greeting. "I have been patient, Miss Marsh. My patience has limits." "I know," Elena said, her voice steady, though her hands were not. "I need a little more time. I am searching for work. My mother is unwell, and I have heard this before," Grady interrupted. 3 months of hearing it, in fact. "I have a family of my own to feed, and empty promises do not fill a table." He glanced past her into the small room, where Nora sat wrapped in a thin blanket, her face turned toward the window, as though she had not heard a word of the exchange, though Elena knew she had heard every word, and pretended otherwise, out of a kind of exhausted dignity. "You have 3 days," Grady said finally. "After that, I will need the room for tenants who can pay." He left without waiting for a response, and Elena closed the door slowly, leaning her forehead against the wood for a long moment, before turning back to face her mother, who was watching her now with tired, apologetic eyes. "I am sorry," Nora said softly. "If I were well enough to work, none of this would fall on you alone." "Do not apologize," Elena said, crossing the room and kneeling beside her mother's chair. "None of this is your doing. We will manage. We always have." But even as she said it, Elena did not fully believe her own words. 3 days was not enough time to find steady work, not in a village where every shop already had its seamstress, every household already had its maid, and every farm already had more hands than it needed. She thought, briefly and with a stab of guilt, of the watch she had carried to the manor the day before, of the coins it might have brought, and she pushed the thought away as quickly as it had come, ashamed of herself for even considering it now, a full day after the choice had already been made. She spent that morning walking from shop to shop, offering to mend clothing, to clean floors, to do anything that might bring in a few coins before evening. Most doors closed gently but firmly. The baker's wife offered her half a loaf of bread out of pity rather than payment, which Elena accepted with a quiet thank you and a private ache of humiliation. By midday, she had earned exactly nothing, and the 3 days Grady had given her felt less like a mercy and more like a slow countdown to the moment her mother would have nowhere to sleep. It was nearly noon when a boy came running down the lane calling her name, out of breath, his cap askew. "Miss Marsh, Miss Marsh, there is a man at the crossing asking for you by name. Says he has come from Ashworth Manor." Elena's first thought was fear, quick and sharp, that somehow the watch had been questioned, that someone believed she had done something wrong, that the kindness she thought she had shown had instead brought trouble to her door. She hurried to the crossing regardless, because there was no version of her life anymore where she could afford to ignore any possibility, however frightening. The man waiting there was not Colby, and not the groundskeeper she had spoken with the day before, but a younger man in a neat coat who introduced himself as Oliver, a clerk employed by the estate. He held a folded letter, sealed with wax, and handed it to her with a small bow that made her feel strangely uncomfortable, as though she had suddenly become someone worth bowing to. "The estate requests your presence tomorrow morning," Oliver said. "There is a matter they wish to discuss with you directly." "What matter?" Elena asked, turning the letter over in her hands without opening it. "I was not told the details," Oliver admitted. Only that you are expected, and that it concerns the item you returned yesterday. Elena's chest tightened. She thanked him, and he left, without further explanation, and she stood at the crossing for a long moment, before finally breaking the wax seal and unfolding the letter. The handwriting was elegant, careful, clearly written by someone with a fine education, and it asked, simply and formally, that she present herself at Ashworth Manor the following morning at 10 o'clock, to discuss a matter of some importance regarding her recent visit. She read it 3 times, searching for some hint of what awaited her, but the letter gave nothing away. That night, she told her mother only that she had been asked to return to the manor, careful not to raise hopes that might collapse into nothing by morning. Nora, ever practical despite her illness, told her to wear her best dress, the blue one with the mended collar, and to hold her head high no matter what she found there. Sleep did not come easily. Elena lay awake turning over every possible explanation, from the frightening to the foolish. Perhaps the watch had been reported stolen before she found it, and she was being summoned to answer for a crime she had not committed. Perhaps the groundskeeper had spoken of her to someone in the household, and she was about to be offered honest work at last. Perhaps it was nothing at all, some formality required whenever an item of value changed hands, a signature needed, a record kept. She told herself not to hope for too much, and failed entirely at following her own advice. Morning came gray and cool, and Elena dressed carefully in the blue dress her mother had suggested, brushing the hem clean of the mud it had gathered from years of careful mending. She kissed her mother's forehead before leaving, promising to return with news, whatever that news turned out to be, and walked the familiar road toward the manor, with a knot of nervous energy in her stomach that no amount of steady breathing seemed to loosen. This time, Colby was waiting at the gate, and his manner toward her had changed entirely from the suspicion of 2 days before. He greeted her with something close to respect, opening the gate himself, and leading her not through the side garden path, but up the main drive, toward the grand front entrance she had only glimpsed from a distance the last time she had come. Elena's nerves grew sharper with every step, the great stone house looming larger and more imposing the closer she came, until she stood at last before its heavy wooden doors, feeling entirely unprepared for whatever lay on the other side. "They are expecting you," Colby said, and pushed the door open before she could ask any of the dozen questions crowding her mind. Inside, the hall was grander than anything Elena had ever seen, with high ceilings and portraits lining the walls, faces of ancestors staring down at her, as though judging whether she belonged there at all. A woman, in a neat gray dress, approached, introducing herself as Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, her expression polite but unreadable. "This way, please," she said, and led Elena down a long corridor toward a set of double doors at the far end. Elena's heart pounded as Mrs. Whitfield knocked twice and pushed the doors open, revealing a study lined with books, sunlight pouring through tall windows, and a man seated behind a heavy desk who rose the moment she entered. It took Elena a full 3 seconds to recognize him, and when she did, the recognition hit her like cold water. It was the groundskeeper, the same brown coat, though pressed now and worn with an air of authority rather than labor, the same eyes that had studied her so carefully 2 days before, except now, standing behind that desk, in that study, with Mrs. Whitfield addressing him with a small bow of her own, there was no mistaking who he truly was. "You," Elena said, before she could stop herself, the word slipping out sharp with confusion and something close to betrayal. "Please," the man said, gesturing to a chair across from the desk. "Sit. I owe you an explanation, and I intend to give you one." Elena did not sit immediately. She stood there, taking in the study, the books, the man who had let her believe he tended gardens for a living, while she poured out fragments of her honesty to him, without knowing who truly listened. "You are the lord of this house," she said slowly, needing to hear the words aloud to believe them. "I am," he said, "Reginald Ashworth, and you are Elena Marsh, who walked an hour in the rain, to return something you had every reason to keep, and who did not know that the man receiving it was the very person you had come to see." "Why did you deceive me?" Elena asked, and though her voice remained steady, something in her chest had gone tight and cold. Reginald's expression grew serious, the faint amusement of their first meeting entirely gone. "Because I no longer trust what people show me when they know who I am," he said. "I have been lied to, flattered, and deceived by more people than I can count, all of them smiling at me while calculating what they might gain. I wanted to see who you were, when you believed no reward, no recognition, no advantage, waited for you at the end of your journey. I wanted to know if your honesty was real, or simply a performance for an audience you believed important. Elena stared at him, torn between anger at having been tested without her knowledge, and a strange, unexpected understanding of why a man in his position might have grown so wary of the world around him. "And what did you decide?" she asked finally, sitting slowly into the chair he had offered. "I decided," Reginald said, "that I have rarely met anyone as honest as you, Miss Marsh, and I intend to make sure that honesty does not go unrewarded, whether you wish it to or not." "I do not want a reward," Elena said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, though she did not try to soften them. "I did not walk here for money, and I will not accept it now simply because you have revealed yourself to be someone important. That was never the point." Reginald studied her for a moment, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "Most people in your position would take whatever I offered without a second thought," he said. "You understand that, I hope. Whatever pride you feel right now does not change the fact that you have a mother who is unwell, a landlord who is losing patience, and very little standing between your household and disaster." Elena's jaw tightened. "How do you know about my mother, about Mr. Grady?" "I asked," Reginald said simply. "After you left the garden yesterday, I made inquiries. It was not difficult to learn who you are in a village this size, Miss Marsh. Everyone speaks of the seamstress caring for her sick mother, and the landlord growing impatient with her debts." The knowledge that her private troubles had become the subject of inquiry by a man she had met only once left Elena feeling exposed in a way she had not anticipated. "You had no right," she said quietly. "Perhaps not," Reginald admitted, "but I am not sorry for it. I needed to understand the full weight of what you refused when you carried that watch here instead of selling it. You did not simply choose honesty over a small comfort, Miss Marsh. You chose it while staring down eviction, hunger, and the illness of someone you love. Do you understand how rare that is?" Elena said nothing for a long moment, staring at her own hands folded tightly in her lap. Part of her wanted to accept whatever he offered, to end the argument, and walk away with enough to save her mother and secure their room for another month. But a deeper, more stubborn part of her refused to let this become a transaction, refused to let her one honest act be reduced to a favor traded for coin. "If you give me money simply for returning what was never mine to keep," she said finally, lifting her eyes to meet his, "then it will feel exactly like the reward Mr. Colby accused me of seeking at your gate. I would rather leave with nothing than prove him right." Something shifted in Reginald's expression, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by something closer to respect. "Then let me propose something different," he said. "Not charity. Employment. This household has need of someone skilled with a needle, someone who can mend and alter garments for the staff and for visiting guests. It is honest work, Miss Marsh, and it pays a fair wage for fair labor. Nothing more, nothing less." The offer sounded reasonable, even generous, but a small voice, in the back of her mind, warned her against accepting too quickly, against trusting a man who had already shown himself willing to deceive her once, for the sake of a test she had not agreed to. "Why should I trust that this offer is not simply another version of the same test?" she asked. Reginald leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something like genuine warmth crossed his face. "You should not trust it blindly," he said. "Trust is earned slowly, Miss Marsh, the same way I am only beginning to earn yours. But I will tell you this plainly. I have no further tests prepared for you. What I am offering is real, and you are free to refuse it, though I hope you will not." Elena thought of her mother, thin and weak by the window, of Grady's cold voice demanding rent she did not have, of the 3 days that had already begun to slip away while she sat in this grand study arguing about pride. Practical necessity pressed against her stubborn dignity, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, weighing which side of herself she was willing to listen to. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is not a small decision, and I will not make it simply because I am desperate." "Take the time you need," Reginald said, rising from his chair as she stood to leave. "But Miss Marsh, I would ask you not to let pride cost you and your mother more than either of you can afford to lose." The words followed her out of the study, down the long corridor, past the watchful portraits, and out through the heavy front doors into the gray daylight beyond. Colby walked her to the gate without a word, his earlier suspicion replaced now by something Elena could not quite read. perhaps curiosity, perhaps quiet approval, though he offered nothing more than a polite farewell as she passed through. The walk home felt longer than it had that morning, every step weighed down by the argument still churning in her mind. She wanted to believe Reginald's offer was exactly what it appeared to be. Honest work, for honest wages, no strings attached, no further tests hidden beneath the surface. But a lifetime of hard lessons had taught her that generosity rarely came without a cost, and she could not shake the fear that accepting his offer might mean surrendering some part of herself she was not prepared to give. When she reached home, she found her mother sitting exactly where she had left her, though her face looked paler than it had that morning, her breathing shallow and uneven, in a way that sent a cold spike of worry through Elena's chest. "Mother," she said, rushing to kneel beside the chair. "Are you all right?" "I am tired," Nora said, though the effort of speaking clearly cost her something. "It will pass. Tell me, what happened at the manor?" Elena hesitated, unwilling to burden her mother with the full complexity of the morning's events. But Nora's steady gaze demanded honesty, and Elena found herself explaining everything: the deception, the reveal, the offer of employment, her own reluctance to accept anything that felt like charity, dressed up as opportunity. Nora listened without interruption, and when Elena finished, she reached out and took her daughter's hand in her own thin fingers. "You have always been proud," she said softly. "It is a quality I admire in you, even when it frightens me. But pride does not keep a roof over our heads, Elena. If this man is offering honest work you are capable of doing well, then perhaps it is not charity at all. Perhaps it is simply an opportunity that found you, the same way that Watch found you on a park bench." Elena said nothing, staring at the worn floorboards beneath her feet, torn between her mother's gentle wisdom and her own fierce need to prove that her honesty had not been for sale, that whatever came next would come because she chose it freely, not because circumstance had left her no other choice. That evening, as she prepared what little food remained in their small kitchen, a sharp knock sounded at the door once more, and Elena's stomach dropped, certain it was Grady returning early to demand what she still could not pay. It was Oliver, the young clerk from the estate, his expression grave, holding a second letter sealed with the same careful wax as before. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I am sorry to disturb you again so soon, but there has been a development at the manor, and Lord Ashworth asked that I bring this to you at once." Elena took the letter with trembling hands, her mind racing through every possible reason a second summons might arrive so quickly after the first, none of them offering her any comfort at all. She broke the seal quickly, unfolding the letter beneath the dim glow of the doorway candle, and read words that made her stomach twist even tighter than before. The letter explained, in Reginald's careful handwriting, that Mr. Grady had come to the manor that very afternoon, not to collect rent, but to warn the household against her, claiming she had schemed her way into 2 private meetings with the Lord and was surely angling for money, or worse. He had spoken loudly, in front of several members of staff, and word of his accusations had already begun spreading through the village, faster than Elena could have imagined possible. "He asks that I come speak with him at once," Elena said aloud, mostly to herself, as Oliver waited politely on the step. "To address what has been said, Lord Ashworth was quite firm with Mr. Grady," Oliver offered, perhaps sensing her distress. "He did not tolerate the accusations kindly, but he believed it was only fair that you know what is being said before it reaches your door from someone less considerate." Elena thanked him, and once he had gone, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, the candle flickering in the evening breeze, feeling something cold settle over her that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. She had spent her entire life building a reputation for honesty, in a village that offered little else of value to a woman with no dowry and no family name. Now, in the span of 2 days, a landlord's bitterness threatened to unravel it entirely, painting her as exactly the kind of scheming, opportunistic person she had refused to become when she carried that watch to the manor instead of selling it. She barely slept that night, and by the time morning arrived, gray and heavy with the promise of more rain, she had made her decision. She would not hide from whatever rumors Grady had spread. She would walk into the village, speak to whoever would listen, and let her own actions answer whatever accusations had been made against her character, because she refused to let fear silence her twice in 1 week. The village square was busier than usual when she arrived, and she felt the weight of eyes turning toward her the moment she stepped into view, Whispers passing between the women gathered near the well, glances exchanged among the men outside the tavern. She held her chin high and walked directly toward the small crowd rather than around it, refusing to let their suspicion dictate where she was permitted to go. "Miss Marsh," called a woman named Grace, who ran the small shop selling thread and buttons, and who had known Elena since childhood. "Is it true what Mr. Grady says, that you have been seen at the manor, cozying up to the Lord for his money?" "I have been to the manor twice," Elena said clearly, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The first time, I returned a watch I found on a bench, because it was not mine to keep. The second time, I was summoned to discuss the matter further, and to be offered honest employment, which I have not yet decided whether to accept. There has been no scheming, Grace, and no cozying, only a woman doing what she believed was right, and a household deciding how to properly acknowledge it." Her voice carried across the square, steady and unashamed, and though a few faces remained skeptical, Grace's expression softened visibly. "That does sound like you," she admitted. "You were always too proud to take what was not earned, even as a girl." Not everyone in the square was so easily persuaded, and Elena caught the eye of Grady himself, standing near the tavern with two other men. His expression twisted into something close to satisfaction at having caused her this much trouble. She walked toward him deliberately, ignoring the murmurs that followed her across the square. "Mr. Grady," she said, stopping a respectful distance from him, "I understand you have concerns about my visits to the manor. I have just explained them to anyone willing to listen, and I will explain them to you now as well, plainly. I found something of value and returned it. I was offered work in return. There is nothing more to the story, and I would ask that you stop suggesting otherwise to people who have no way of knowing the truth." Grady's face reddened slightly, caught between the two men, who had clearly heard his earlier accusations, and now watched to see how he would respond to being confronted directly. "I only said what seemed reasonable," he muttered. "A woman in your circumstances, suddenly welcome at the manor, twice in 3 days. What was I to think?" "You might have asked me," Elena said simply, rather than assuming the worst and repeating it to anyone who would listen. She left him standing there without waiting for a reply, her heart pounding from the confrontation, but her spirit lighter than it had been in days, having faced the rumor directly, rather than allowing it to grow unchecked in her absence. As she walked home, however, a new worry began to surface, one that had nothing to do with Grady, or the village square at all. If word of her visits to the manor had spread this quickly, and this dramatically, what might it mean for Reginald himself, a man whose reputation and standing depended on far more scrutiny than her own ever had? She arrived home to find her mother worse than she had left her, struggling for breath in a way that frightened Elena more than anything Grady had said in the square. She rushed to her mother's side, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, calling softly for her to breathe slowly, to stay calm, while her own heart hammered with a fear sharper than any rumor could produce. There was no physician in the village who would come without payment up front, and Elena had nothing left to offer, no coin, no favor, nothing but the desperate hope that her mother's strength would hold until morning. It was Oliver again who arrived that evening, this time not with a sealed letter but with a small carriage waiting on the lane, sent by Reginald himself the moment word reached him, through channels Elena did not fully understand, that her mother had taken a turn for the worse. "Lord Ashworth has sent for the estate physician," Oliver explained quickly. "He insists there is no cost to you, Miss Marsh. Please, allow him to help." Elena hesitated only a moment, pride warring one final time against the plain, undeniable fact that her mother needed care she could not provide alone, and then stepped aside to let the physician into their small home, grateful beyond words, even as some stubborn corner of her mind whispered that she was now indebted to a man whose motives she still did not fully trust. The physician worked through the night, and by dawn, Nora's breathing had steadied, her fever broken, her color slowly returning, as she slipped into a deep, restorative sleep. Elena sat by her mother's bedside as the sun rose, exhausted but relieved, and it was only then, in the quiet gray light of morning, that she allowed herself to consider what Reginald's swift, unhesitating help truly meant, and what it might cost her pride, to finally accept that some kindnesses were not tests at all, but simply kindness, offered without condition, by a man who perhaps understood better than she had given him credit for what it meant to need help and receive none. 3 days later, Once Nora had regained enough strength to sit up and take broth without assistance, Elena walked to the manor for the third time, though this visit felt entirely different from the two before it. She no longer approached the gates with fear of being turned away, nor with the disorientation of discovering a hidden identity behind a borrowed coat. She walked with the quiet resolve of a woman who had made her decision and intended to see it through on her own terms. Colby greeted her warmly this time, almost like an old acquaintance, and led her directly to the study, where Reginald waited. Though he rose from behind his desk the moment she entered, his expression carrying a trace of concern, he did not bother to hide. "How is your mother?" he asked, before any other pleasantry. "Improving," Elena said. "Thanks to the physician you sent. I have not forgotten that kindness, and I do not intend to." "It was not a kindness meant to be repaid," Reginald said. "I hope you understand that." "I am beginning to," Elena admitted, and something in her tone made his expression ease slightly. "I have come to accept your offer of employment, but I would ask for certain terms, if you are willing to hear them." Reginald gestured for her to sit, settling back into his own chair with obvious interest. "I am listening." "I will mend and alter garments for the household, as you suggested," Elena said. "I will do the work well, and I expect to be paid fairly for it. The same wage any skilled seamstress would earn in a position of this kind. Nothing more. Nothing arranged out of pity or guilt over what happened between us this past week. I do not want special treatment, Lord Ashworth. I want honest work." "Agreed," Reginald said without hesitation. "Mrs. Whitfield will arrange your wages according to the standard the household already pays for skilled labor. You will answer to her directly, the same as any other member of staff." Elena nodded, relief and satisfaction settling over her in equal measure, and for the first time since the whole strange affair had begun, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope rather than suspicion. She spent the following hour with Mrs. Whitfield, touring the small workroom where she would spend her days, meeting the cook, a warm, round-faced woman named Margaret who welcomed her with genuine friendliness, and reviewing the terms of her employment in careful, businesslike detail that left no room for ambiguity about what was expected of her. It was as she was leaving the workroom that afternoon, her arms full of fabric samples Mrs. Whitfield had given her to study, that Elena first encountered the man who would soon become the greatest threat to everything she had just carefully built. He stood in the corridor outside the study, tall and finely dressed, with a sharp, assessing gaze that reminded Elena uncomfortably of a hawk studying prey. It had not yet decided whether to strike. He looked at her the way Colby once had, quick judgment forming before a single word passed between them. "You must be the seamstress my uncle has taken such a sudden interest in," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge Elena did not miss. "Edmund Ashworth. I am the Lord's nephew." "Elena Marsh," she said, offering a small, polite nod, though something about his tone put her instantly on guard. "I have been hired to mend garments for the household." "How generous of my uncle," Edmund said, with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "He has always had a soft spot for charity cases. I hope you understand. Your position here is not as secure as you might believe, Miss Marsh. My uncle's enthusiasms tend to fade quickly." Elena felt heat rise in her chest at the deliberate insult wrapped in false pleasantry, but she kept her expression calm, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be fishing for. "I was not hired out of charity," she said evenly. "I was hired for my skill, and I intend to prove its worth every day I am here." Edmund's smile did not waver, though something flickered behind his eyes, perhaps surprised that she had not shrunk from his implied threat. "We shall see," he said, and moved past her down the corridor without another word, leaving Elena standing alone with a growing unease she could not quite name. That evening, as she walked home carrying her fabric samples and her first week's advance wages tucked carefully into her bag, she mentioned the encounter to her mother, who listened with the sharp attentiveness of a woman who had survived many years by reading the intentions of others carefully. "Be careful of that one," Nora said, once Elena had finished describing the exchange. "Men like that do not resent a seamstress over mended hems, Elena. They resent anyone who might threaten what they believe belongs to them by right." "What could I possibly threaten?" Elena asked, genuinely puzzled. "I am hired to sew, Mother, nothing more." "Perhaps," Nora said slowly, "but you are also the first person your Lord Ashworth has trusted enough to summon back to his home, not once, but twice. and now a third time, to offer honest employment. If this nephew expects to inherit that estate one day, he will not welcome anyone who might change how his uncle sees the world, or who he chooses to trust with it. Elena considered her mother's words long after the candle had been blown out that night, turning Edmund's veiled threat over in her mind, alongside the strange, watchful way he had looked at her, as though already calculating how much trouble she might cause him, simply by existing within those walls. She told herself she was imagining danger where none truly existed, that a nephew's cold manners meant nothing more than ordinary arrogance, common enough among men born into wealth they had not earned. But some quiet instinct, sharpened by years of reading the true intentions behind polite words, refused to let the worry go entirely, and she fell asleep that night with Edmund's thin, calculating smile lingering at the edge of her thoughts. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Elena had not known in years, one built on honest labor and steady, predictable comfort. She rose early, walked the familiar road to the manor, and spent her days in the small workroom, mending torn seams, hemming new garments, and altering old ones for members of the household who treated her with growing warmth and respect. Margaret the cook took to sharing gossip and small kindnesses over midday meals, and Mrs. Whitfield, though strict in her expectations, praised Elena's careful, precise stitching more than once within earshot of other staff. Nora's health continued to improve as well, steady meals and a small but reliable wage doing more for her recovery than any medicine alone could have managed. Reginald, for his part, kept a careful distance that Elena appreciated more than she expected to. He did not summon her to his study unnecessarily, did not draw attention to her presence among the staff, and treated her interactions with the same fair, professional courtesy he extended to everyone else in his employ. Occasionally, passing in a corridor, he would ask after her mother's health, and she would answer honestly, and that would be the extent of their exchange, simple and unremarkable, exactly as she had hoped it would be. Edmund, however, did not extend her the same courtesy. He appeared in the workroom more often than seemed necessary, for a man with no obvious business there, watching her work with an expression she could never quite decipher, sometimes cold, sometimes calculating, always unsettling. It was nearly a month into her employment when he finally cornered her alone, catching her in the small storage room where fabric bolts were kept, as she searched for a particular shade of gray thread requested by one of the household's visiting guests. "You have made yourself quite comfortable here," Edmund said, leaning against the doorframe in a way that blocked her easy exit, though his tone remained light, almost conversational. "Staff talk, you know. They say my uncle asks after you more than he asks after anyone else in this house." "I would not know," Elena said, keeping her attention on the shelves of thread in front of her, refusing to let his presence rattle the steady composure she had worked hard to maintain since their first encounter. "I do my work and go home, each evening. Whatever is said among the staff is not something I concern myself with." "How admirably modest," Edmund said, his voice carrying a thin edge of mockery. "Let me be direct with you, Miss Marsh, since modesty seems to be your preferred performance. My uncle is not a young man, and he has grown sentimental in his old age, testing strangers with lost trinkets, and rewarding whoever passes his little examinations with far more trust than the situation warrants. I find it tiresome. I would find it considerably less tiresome if you were to simply remove yourself from his notice. Perhaps seek employment elsewhere, in a household less likely to complicate matters that do not concern you." Elena finally turned to face him fully, her spine straightening with the same stubborn resolve that had carried her through Grady's accusations in the village square. "Are you asking me to leave, Mr. Ashworth, or are you threatening me?" "I am simply offering advice," Edmund said, though the smile that accompanied the words held nothing friendly in it. "But I could make the advice considerably more persuasive, if necessary. A small sum, perhaps, in exchange for your resignation. Enough to comfortably support your mother somewhere far from this village, somewhere neither of us need think of the other again." The offer, dressed carefully in reasonable language, struck Elena as almost identical to the accusation Grady had thrown at her feet weeks earlier. The assumption that money could solve any inconvenient problem, that her presence, her honesty, her simple willingness to work hard, could be purchased away like any other obstacle standing between Edmund and whatever he truly wanted from his uncle's estate. "I did not take money to return a watch that was never mine," she said slowly, deliberately. "And I will not take money now, to abandon honest work I have earned through my own labor." Whatever concerns you have about your uncle's trust, Mr. Ashworth, they are not mine to solve, and they are certainly not for sale. Edmund's expression hardened, the pretense of friendly conversation dropping away entirely. You should think carefully before refusing me, Miss Marsh, he said, his voice dropping low. I am not accustomed to being told no, and I am considerably more patient with people who understand their place than with those who do not. He left without waiting for a response, and Elena stood alone in the small storage room for several long minutes, her heart pounding not from fear exactly, but from the cold certainty that she had just made an enemy of a man with far more power and far fewer scruples than she had first realized. She said nothing of the encounter to Mrs. Whitfield, nor to Reginald, uncertain whether raising the matter would help her situation, or simply confirm whatever suspicions Edmund already harbored about her supposed scheming. Instead, she returned to her work, finished the alteration she had been sent to complete, and carried the unease home with her that evening, sharing only a vague, careful version of events with her mother, unwilling to worry her further while she was still recovering her strength. But the unease did not fade in the days that followed. Elena began noticing small things she had overlooked before. The way certain ledgers in the estate's account books seemed to pass through Edmund's hands with unusual frequency. The way Margaret occasionally mentioned missing supplies that no one could quite account for. The way Edmund's visits to the manor had grown steadily more frequent over the past several months. Always coinciding, she began to realize, with periods when Reginald himself traveled away on business. She told herself these observations meant nothing, that she was simply allowing Edmund's threats to make her paranoid about matters that did not concern her. But the quiet, careful part of her mind, that had once refused to sell a lost watch, for the sake of her own comfort, could not entirely dismiss the growing sense that something within Ashworth Manor was not as it appeared, and that Edmund's hostility toward her had far less to do with jealousy over his uncle's attention than it did with fear of what she might eventually notice, if given enough time and enough access to the household's quiet, hidden corners. The accusation came on a gray Tuesday morning, sudden and sharp as a slammed door, when Elena arrived at the workroom to find Mrs. Whitfield waiting for her with an expression far more severe than any she had worn before. Beside her stood Edmund, arms crossed, wearing an expression of carefully composed concern that did nothing to disguise the satisfaction lurking beneath it. Miss Marsh, Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice tight and formal, entirely unlike the warm familiarity she had shown over the past month. A silver brooch belonging to the household has gone missing from the guest quarters. It was last seen 3 days ago, in a drawer you had access to while altering a garment for one of our visitors. Elena's stomach dropped, the accusation landing with such unexpected force that for a moment she could not find words at all. I have taken nothing, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the cold shock spreading through her chest. I have never touched anything in that room beyond the garment I was asked to alter. Mr. Ashworth here has raised the concern, Mrs. Whitfield continued, gesturing slightly toward Edmund, whose expression remained carefully neutral. Given your, shall we say, unusual history with valuable lost items, he believed it worth investigating. The reference to the watch, twisted now into something suspicious rather than admirable, struck Elena like a physical blow. She understood immediately what Edmund had done, taking the very act of honesty that had brought her into this household and reshaping it into evidence against her character, planting doubt in exactly the place where her reputation had once seemed strongest. I found that watch and returned it, she said, fighting to keep her voice level. I did not take it, and I have not taken this brooch either. Search my belongings, search my home. You will find nothing, because there is nothing to find. That will not be necessary, Edmund said smoothly, before Mrs. Whitfield could respond. I have already spoken with my uncle about the matter. He is, understandably, quite troubled by the possibility that someone he trusted so completely might have deceived him. Elena's blood ran cold at the implication that Reginald himself already suspected her, that whatever fragile trust they had built over the past month might already be crumbling based on nothing more than Edmund's carefully constructed accusation. I want to speak with him directly, she said. I will not have my character decided by rumor and assumption, while I am kept in a workroom, unable to defend myself. That can certainly be arranged, Edmund said, with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. And Elena understood in that moment that he had planned for exactly this response, that whatever confrontation followed had already been anticipated, and prepared for, in ways she could not yet see. She was led to the study within the hour, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to appear calm, and found Reginald standing near the window rather than seated behind his desk, his expression grave and unreadable in a way that frightened her more than outright anger would have. "Miss Marsh," he said, without preamble, "a serious accusation has been made against you." "I did not take the brooch," Elena said immediately, refusing to wait for further formalities. "Whatever has been suggested to you, Lord Ashworth, I have taken nothing from this household beyond the wages I have honestly earned." "Edmund believes otherwise," Reginald said carefully, watching her closely as he spoke. "He has presented evidence suggesting the brooch was seen in your possession, in the workroom, only yesterday." "That is not possible," Elena said, her mind racing to understand how such a claim could even be constructed, "because I have never seen this brooch, not once, in any room of this house." "Perhaps you would allow a search of the workroom," Reginald said, and though his tone remained measured, Elena caught something beneath it, a flicker of doubt she had never before seen directed toward her, and it hurt far more sharply than any accusation Edmund himself could have leveled. "Search wherever you wish," Elena said, standing straighter despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "I have nothing to hide, and if something is found in that workroom that does not belong there, then someone has placed it there deliberately, because I assure you, Lord Ashworth, I did not." The search was conducted within the hour, Mrs. Whitfield overseeing it personally alongside 2 members of staff, while Elena waited in the corridor outside the workroom, her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt since the night her mother's breathing had grown ragged and uncertain. She watched Edmund pace nearby, his composure never fully cracking, though Elena thought she detected, beneath his careful expression, the faintest trace of impatience, as though he expected a particular outcome, and grew anxious the longer it took to arrive. It was Margaret who emerged first, her round face troubled, holding a small, folded cloth in her outstretched hands. "It was found," she said quietly, tucked inside a basket of scraps beneath the cutting table. Elena's stomach dropped entirely, the cold, sickening realization crashing over her, that the brooch had indeed been found exactly where Edmund had likely placed it himself, in a location accessible enough to implicate her, but hidden enough to avoid suspicion of tampering. "I did not put that there," she said, her voice rising for the first time since the accusation had begun. "Someone else placed it in that basket. I have never seen that brooch before this moment." Reginald's expression, as he examined the recovered item, remained maddeningly unreadable, and for one terrible, suspended moment, Elena feared that the trust she had worked so carefully to build over the past month, the trust that had begun with a watch carried honestly across the rain-soaked village, was about to collapse entirely beneath the weight of evidence, too convenient to be anything but deliberately arranged. Reginald turned the brooch over slowly in his hand, studying it with the same careful, deliberate attention he had once given the watch Elena had carried to his gate weeks earlier. "This is peculiar," he said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge that made Edmund shift slightly where he stood. "This brooch belonged to my late mother. I know its weight, its clasp, the small chip in the stone near its edge. I had it moved to the locked cabinet in my private study nearly 2 months ago, after noticing it required repair. It should not have been anywhere near the guest quarters at all." Silence fell over the corridor, thick and heavy, as the full weight of his words settled over everyone present. Elena felt something loosen slightly in her chest, though she did not yet dare to hope the accusation had truly been overturned. Edmund's composure, so carefully maintained until that moment, flickered visibly, a brief widening of his eyes, before he caught himself, and forced his expression back into practiced calm. "Perhaps a servant moved it without your knowledge," Edmund said quickly, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "These things happen, Uncle. Items get shifted, forgotten, misplaced." "Perhaps," Reginald said, though his tone made clear he did not believe it. "Except I recall quite distinctly asking you, Edmund, to arrange for its repair, given your familiarity with the jeweler in town. That was 6 weeks ago. You told me it had been seen to." Edmund said nothing, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any denial could have. Reginald set the brooch down carefully on a nearby table, and turned to face his nephew fully, the warmth Elena had come to associate with him, entirely replaced by something colder, harder, the expression of a man who had spent years building careful tests to uncover exactly this kind of deception, only to find it hiding far closer to home than he had ever suspected. "I think," Reginald said slowly, "it is time we reviewed the household accounts together, Edmund. All of them. Starting with the ledgers you have managed on my behalf these past 2 years, particularly during my travels." The color drained visibly from Edmund's face, and Elena watched, still standing in the corridor with her heart pounding, as the careful, calculating man who had threatened and manipulated her for weeks suddenly looked very small indeed, cornered by a truth he had clearly hoped would never surface. "There is no need for that," Edmund said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely. "This is a matter concerning the seamstress, not the accounts." "On the contrary," Reginald said, "I believe it has become very much a matter concerning the accounts. Miss Marsh's honesty brought a lost item back to my gate weeks ago, without hesitation, without expectation of reward. Your accusation against her, built on evidence that could not possibly exist as you claimed, has revealed considerably more about your own character than hers. Mrs. Whitfield, please summon the household solicitor. I believe we have matters to discuss that extend well beyond a missing brooch." Edmund attempted, briefly, to protest further, but the weight of the evidence, and the sudden, unmistakable shift in his uncle's demeanor, left him with little room to maneuver. He was escorted from the manor grounds within the hour, his belongings gathered hastily by staff, who no longer bothered to hide their relief at his departure. And it would be several days before the full extent of his deception became clear, uncovered slowly, through the careful review of ledgers that revealed years of quietly diverted funds, false expenses, and payments to accounts that traced back, eventually, to Edmund himself. Elena remained in the corridor long after Edmund had gone, still absorbing the sudden, dizzying reversal of fortune that had carried her from accused thief to vindicated victim within the span of a single conversation. Reginald approached her slowly, his expression softened now from the hardness he had shown his nephew, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for even a moment of doubt. You have given me nothing but honesty since the day I met you disguised as a groundskeeper, and I allowed circumstance to shake that trust far too easily. You searched for the truth rather than simply accepting the accusation," Elena said, surprising herself with how readily forgiveness came, once the fear had finally drained from her chest. "That is more than most people would have done, Lord Ashworth. I cannot fault you for demanding proof, even when the proof concerned me directly." "Nonetheless," Reginald said, "I owe you more than an apology. Whatever trust exists between us now, I intend to make certain it is never tested so carelessly again." Elena said nothing further, simply nodding, exhausted from the morning's events in a way that settled deep into her bones. As she finally made her way home that evening, the sky clearing for the first time in what felt like weeks, she found herself thinking not of Edmund's downfall, nor of the accusation that had briefly threatened everything she had worked so carefully to build, but of the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken since the morning she found a broken pocket watch lying forgotten on a rain-soaked bench, and chose, against every practical instinct urging her otherwise, to carry it home to the man who owned it, rather than to the market where it might have bought her comfort at the cost of everything she truly valued about herself. In the weeks following Edmund's departure, the household at Ashworth Manor settled into a calm it had not known in years. Mrs. Whitfield, who had watched the entire affair unfold with quiet unease, began treating Elena with a warmth that bordered on genuine friendship, often lingering in the workroom to share news of the estate, or ask after Nora's continued recovery. Margaret took to setting aside the choicest portions of the midday meal for Elena without being asked, a small gesture that meant more to her than any of the staff likely realized. Even Colby, who had once turned her away at the gate with open suspicion, greeted her each morning with a respectful nod that carried genuine regard rather than mere formality. Reginald, for his part, seemed a changed man, in ways both subtle and unmistakable. He no longer spoke of testing strangers with hidden valuables, and when Mrs. Whitfield mentioned, in passing one afternoon, that a small ring had been found near the chapel steps, and asked whether it should be quietly placed as bait for another examination of village honesty, Reginald had simply shaken his head and instructed her to post a notice in the village, asking whoever had lost it to claim it plainly, without deception, without hidden motives disguised as chance encounters. "I have learned what I needed to learn," he told Elena one afternoon, when she mentioned the exchange to him directly. curious whether his old habits had truly faded, or simply gone quiet for a time. I spent years believing the only honest reactions came from people who did not know they were being watched. I understand now that honesty revealed under scrutiny is no less real than honesty performed in secret. You proved that to me more thoroughly than any test I could have devised myself, Miss Marsh, simply by remaining exactly who you are, whether I appeared as a groundskeeper or as myself. Elena found herself smiling more easily in his presence than she once thought possible. The wariness that had defined their earliest encounters, slowly giving way to something steadier, built not on deception or hidden agendas, but on the plain, ordinary trust that grows between two people who have weathered difficulty together and emerged with their regard for one another intact. She did not allow herself to consider what that growing warmth might mean, beyond simple friendship, mindful of the vast gulf that still separated a seamstress from a lord, however much the household around them seemed to have stopped noticing the distinction entirely. Nora, meanwhile, had regained enough strength to take on small tasks of her own, mending simple items for neighbors, in exchange for modest payment. Her color returned, her breathing steady. The illness that had once threatened to overwhelm them both, now reduced to a distant, difficult memory, rather than a daily terror. She often asked after the manor, after Reginald, after the strange twists of fortune that had carried her daughter from a rain-soaked park bench to steady employment within the grandest household in the county, and Elena found herself sharing these details more freely with each passing week, no longer guarding her words out of fear that speaking them aloud might somehow undo the good fortune they described. It was Nora who first noticed, with the quiet perceptiveness of a mother who had spent years reading her daughter's moods, that Elena's descriptions of Reginald had shifted subtly over the preceding months, growing warmer, more detailed, lingering longer than the simple facts of her employment strictly required. "You speak of him differently now," Nora observed one evening, as Elena described a conversation from earlier that day about a shipment of fine wool arriving for the household's autumn garments. "Not as an employer, Elena, as something closer to a friend, perhaps closer still." Elena felt her cheeks warm at the observation, though she did not deny it outright. "He has shown me nothing but fairness since Edmund's departure," she said carefully. "It would be strange not to regard him with some warmth, after everything we have weathered together." "I did not say it was a bad thing," Nora replied gently, a small, knowing smile crossing her tired face. "Only that I notice it, and that I wonder whether you have allowed yourself to notice it as well." Elena said nothing further that evening, turning the observation over quietly in her mind long after the candle had been extinguished, uncertain what to make of feelings she had not permitted herself to examine too closely, mindful of every practical reason such feelings might lead nowhere but disappointment. Yet she could not entirely dismiss the small, steady warmth that had settled in her chest whenever Reginald's name arose, nor the way her days at the manor had come to feel less like labor performed for wages and more like time spent in the company of someone whose regard she had come, gradually, and without quite meaning to value above almost anything else in her carefully rebuilt life. Autumn arrived early that year, painting the fields around Ashworth Manor in deep gold and amber, and it was on one such crisp afternoon, as Elena walked the garden path toward the workroom, carrying a bundle of newly delivered wool, that Reginald found her, standing near the same stone wall where they had first spoken, while he still wore the disguise of a simple groundskeeper. He fell into step beside her without a word at first, the comfortable silence between them a testament to how far their acquaintance had traveled since that rain-soaked morning months before. "Do you remember," he said finally, "the first thing you said to me, believing I was nothing more than a servant tending these gardens?" "I told you I found something that belonged to your master," Elena said, smiling faintly at the memory, "and you let me believe it for far longer than was fair." "I did," Reginald admitted, with no trace of apology in his tone, only a quiet fondness for the memory itself. "I have thought often since then about what might have happened had you simply sold that watch, as anyone in your circumstances would have been forgiven for doing. I would never have known you existed, Miss Marsh. My nephew's deception might have gone undiscovered for years longer, quietly draining this estate while I remained blind to it. And I would have continued believing that honesty was a rare, almost mythical quality, glimpsed only in stories, never truly encountered in the ordinary business of living." "You give the watch too much credit," Elena said, though warmth spread through her chest at his words nonetheless. "It was a small choice, made in a moment of exhaustion and cold. I did not intend for it to unravel quite so much. Perhaps, Reginald said, stopping beside the stone wall and turning to face her fully. But small choices, made honestly, in moments when no one is watching to reward them, are precisely the ones that reveal the truest measure of a person's character. You did not know I would ever learn of your choice that morning. You made it regardless. That is not a small thing, Elena, whatever modesty tells you to believe. It was the first time he had used her given name, rather than the formal address he had maintained since revealing his true identity, and Elena felt the shift settle over her with quiet significance, an acknowledgement of everything that had changed between them since that first rain-soaked meeting. Reginald, she said, testing the familiarity of his own name in return, and found that it fit easily, comfortably, as though some part of her had been waiting for permission to speak it aloud. They stood together by the stone wall as the afternoon light softened into evening, saying little more, needing little more. The comfortable understanding between them, requiring no grand declaration to feel complete. In the months that followed, their friendship deepened steadily into something neither of them rushed to name too quickly, content instead to let it grow at its own honest pace, built not on tests or hidden motives, but on the plain, steady trust that had been earned through hardship, honesty, and the quiet courage of a woman who had once chosen integrity over comfort, without ever expecting the world to notice. Nora lived to see her daughter settled comfortably, her health fully restored, her days spent no longer in fear of eviction or hunger, but in steady, honest labor, within a household that had come to regard her not as a curiosity or a test subject, but as one of its own. The village, too, gradually forgot the rumors Grady had once spread so eagerly, replaced instead by a quiet, growing pride in the seamstress who had returned a lost timepiece, and, in doing so, uncovered far more than either she or the man who lost it could ever have anticipated. Reginald Ashworth never again left valuables scattered in public places to test the character of strangers passing by. He had found in the end exactly what he had spent years searching for, not through careful deception or hidden observation, but through the simple, unguarded honesty of a woman who had never once considered herself remarkable, and who had walked an hour through the rain simply because it was the right thing to do, unaware that a lost timepiece would one day return to her, far more than she had ever given away.